Every 50 years, the commodity markets stage a massacre, and we're right on schedule for the next one. It doesn't matter if it's wheat, oil, copper, or food. It doesn't matter if you're living in the agricultural heartland of 1920s America, the industrial cities of 1970s Europe, or the interconnected global economy of today. The pattern is always identical. Stability breeds complacency. Complacency breeds vulnerability. And then the violence arrives overnight, catching an entire generation completely unprepared. The 1920s saw agricultural abundance turn into a curse that destroyed American farmers by the hundreds of thousands. Crop prices that had made families wealthy during World War I collapsed by 70% within 3 years. Farmers who had mortgaged everything to expand production found themselves burning corn in their stoves because it was cheaper than coal, selling it wouldn't even cover the cost of transportation. Rural banks began failing in 1923, 6 full years before Wall Street even noticed there was a problem. The agricultural depression that would trigger the Great Depression had already been unfolding in silence across the heartland. Fast forward exactly 50 years. October 1973. Oil prices quadruple in a matter of weeks. Americans who had never faced scarcity in their lives suddenly found themselves sitting in gas station lines that stretched for miles, engines idling, tempers flaring, some sleeping overnight in their cars just to reach the pump by morning. The government responded exactly as governments always do when faced with a supply shock they can't control. They printed money to subsidize the crisis. The result? Stagflation, a nightmare combination of recession and inflation that Keynesian economists had sworn was theoretically impossible. By 1980, inflation hit 14.8%, interest rates spiked to 20%, and an entire generation watched their savings evaporate. And now we're 50 years past that crisis. It's 2024. The pattern doesn't care about artificial intelligence, modern monetary theory, or central bank PhD programs. The cycle is completing exactly on schedule, and this time it's not just one commodity. Food prices have surged 30 to 40% since 2020 and they're not coming back down. Energy costs are restructuring entire economies. The metals needed for every green transition fantasy are in structural deficit. Supply chains that were supposed to be optimized by technology seized up and revealed themselves to be catastrophically fragile. And governments around the world have responded with the same playbook that failed every time before: print trillions of dollars and pray that somehow, this time, the laws of supply and demand won't apply. They printed $10 trillion in the United States alone since 2020. 20 trillion globally. The largest monetary expansion in human history, unleashed to fight a problem that money printing cannot solve: physical scarcity. Every warning sign that preceded the 1920s agricultural collapse is flashing. Every indicator that foretold the 1970s oil shocks is screaming. We are in the danger zone. Tonight we're examining 3 complete 50-year cycles, and what happened to every nation that ignored the pattern. Because the math doesn't lie, and the cycle has never been wrong. Not once. Not ever. The pattern is always identical. It doesn't matter if you're analyzing Roman grain markets in the 3rd century, American agricultural collapse in the 1920s, Middle Eastern oil in the 1970s, or the polycrisis unfolding right now. The 50-year commodity shock cycle follows 5 brutal stages with mathematical precision. And understanding these stages is the difference between recognizing what's coming and being destroyed by it. Stage 1, the shock. Years 0 through 15. Prices spike violently. Supply chain seize. Governments panic. The economy convulses as everyone scrambles to secure resources that were abundant just months earlier. Stage 2, the recovery. Years 15 through 35. The panic subsides. New supply comes online as producers rush to capture high prices. Infrastructure gets built. Stockpiles rebuild. Prices normalize. And slowly, gradually, the memory of the crisis begins to fade. The people who lived through the shock are still around, still in positions of power, still remembering. But they're aging out. Stage 3, the complacency. Years 35 through 45. This is where the trap gets set. The generation that experienced the shock firsthand is retiring or dying. New leaders step in, people who were children during the crisis, or not born yet. They've only known stability. They've spent their entire careers in a world of abundant commodities and functioning supply chains. Investment in production slows because prices are stable and returns are mediocre. This time is different, they say. Modern finance has solved the ancient problem of scarcity. Stage 4, the setup. Years 45 through 50. Supply constraints build invisibly beneath the surface. Decades of underinvestment leave production capacity unable to meet surging demand. Inventories begin draining. Warning signs flash, but they're dismissed as temporary or manageable. After all, it's been nearly 50 years since the last real crisis. Anyone who remembers it is long gone from the decision-making apparatus. The people running central banks, energy departments, and agricultural ministries were in diapers, or didn't exist, the last time this happened. Stage 5, the next shock. Year 50 and beyond. The cycle completes. And it always repeats with even more violence than before, because the system is larger, more interconnected, more fragile, and more leveraged than it was 50 years ago. Why does this work with such brutal consistency? Because human memory spans 25 to 30 years. A career in finance or government lasts 3 decades at most. By the time the cycle completes, every single person making policy decisions has only known the stability phase. They are operating investment committees, central banks, and government agencies filled with people who have only known abundance. They cannot conceive of genuine scarcity because they have never experienced it. The cycle started violently in the 1920s, when agricultural abundance turned into a curse that destroyed an entire generation. And nobody saw it coming. Let's start with the first massacre. The 1920s. When American agriculture went from boom to apocalypse in the time it takes to harvest a single crop. The setup was perfect. World War I turned American farmers into heroes and millionaires simultaneously. European fields became battlegrounds, their crops burned, their farmers conscripted into trenches. The world was starving, and American agriculture was the only solution. Wheat prices exploded from under $1 a bushel to $2.50 by 1919. Corn, cotton, livestock, every agricultural commodity surged to record highs. Farmers who had scraped by for generations suddenly had cash. Real wealth. The kind that makes you believe in infinite prosperity. So they did what every generation does when they mistake a temporary boom for permanent abundance: they borrowed against the future. Farmers mortgaged everything, their land, their equipment, their homes, to expand production. They paid $200 per acre for land that had sold for $50 just 5 years earlier. Banks, flush with wartime deposits and agricultural profits, handed out loans with abandon. Production capacity doubled, then doubled again. The grain elevators couldn't hold the surplus. Everyone was getting rich. And then 1920 arrived. The war ended. European production came back online. And American farmers suddenly found themselves in catastrophic oversupply. The global market that had desperately needed their wheat, their corn, their cotton, it didn't need them anymore. Wheat prices collapsed by 50% within months. Then kept falling. By 1932, wheat that had sold for $2.50 per bushel in 1919 fetched 67 cents. A 73% collapse. But that number, as brutal as it sounds, doesn't capture the devastation on the ground. Farmers who had paid $200 per acre for land in 1919 watched its value crater to $50 by 1925. A 75% loss. Mortgages that seemed manageable during the boom became impossible. You borrowed $150 per acre expecting to sell wheat at $2.50 per bushel. Now you're selling at $1, then 80 cents, then 67 cents, and the bank still wants its payment. In full. On time. In dollars that are worth far more than when you borrowed them. The sensory reality of the collapse is what makes it visceral. Farmers burned corn in their stoves because selling it wouldn't even cover the cost of transporting it to market. They dumped milk into ditches because dairy prices fell below production costs. It was literally cheaper to destroy the product than to bring it to town. Foreclosure signs spread across the Midwest heartland like a disease, appearing on farms that had been in the same family for 3 generations. Entire families packed what they could carry and walked away from land their grandparents had broken with their hands. And then the banks started failing. This is the part that gets forgotten in the traditional narrative of the Great Depression. Everyone remembers 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crash, Wall Street bankers leaping from windows. But the agricultural depression started in 1923. 6 full years before Wall Street noticed there was a problem. Rural banks that had financed farm expansion began collapsing in waves. 5,000 rural banks failed between 1923 and 1929. Not during the Great Depression, before it. The financial contagion started in farming communities in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota. It just took 6 years to reach New York. The commodity collapse wasn't limited to wheat. Cotton cratered. Corn became worthless. Livestock prices fell so low that ranchers couldn't afford to transport cattle to slaughter. The entire agricultural economy, the backbone of American prosperity, was collapsing in slow motion while the cities threw parties and the stock market soared. Between 1929 and 1933, farmer income fell by 50%. But it had already fallen by 40% in the 6 years before that. Suicide rates in rural areas spiked. Political extremism took root in agricultural states, populist movements, proto-fascist organizations, radical farm cooperatives that threatened to march on state capitals. The social fabric was tearing. And the government's response? They tried to prop up prices artificially through market intervention, which destroyed what remained of global agricultural trade and made everything worse. The commodity boom that made farmers wealthy in the 1910s destroyed them in the 1920s, because the cycle turned and nobody was ready. It took 50 years for the lesson to fade. By the 1970s, a new generation of leaders believed modern economics had solved the problem of scarcity. Then oil showed them the pattern never died. Fast forward exactly 50 years from the agricultural collapse. October 1973. The pattern repeats, only this time it's faster, more violent, and it doesn't destroy farmers in the heartland, it brings the entire industrialized world to its knees. The setup, once again, was perfect complacency. The 1950s and 1960s were the golden age of cheap energy. Oil sold for roughly $3 per barrel, so abundant, so cheap, that entire economies restructured themselves around the assumption of infinite petroleum. American suburbs sprawled outward, connected by highways designed for gas-guzzling V8 engines. Industries built factories without any concern for energy efficiency because fuel was essentially free. Nobody invested in alternatives. Nobody needed to. The people making those decisions had never experienced scarcity. They were children during the 1920s agricultural crisis, or not born yet. They had spent their entire adult lives in a world where you turned the key and the engine started, every single time, without question. And then October 17, 1973 arrived. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced an oil embargo targeting nations that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Within weeks, oil prices quadrupled. $3 per barrel became $12 per barrel. Seemingly overnight, gas stations across America ran dry. Cars lined up for blocks, hundreds of vehicles, engines idling, drivers anxious, uncertain, some sleeping in their cars overnight just to secure a position near the front of the line when the next tanker arrived. For the first time in American history, peacetime rationing became reality. States implemented odd-even systems based on license plate numbers. If your plate ended in an odd number, you could buy gas on odd-numbered days. Even plates, even days. Fistfights broke out at pumps over accusations of cutting in line. The image of American abundance, the land of plenty, the nation that had never known shortage, shattered in a matter of weeks. The government's response was textbook disaster. Richard Nixon had already destroyed the dollar's gold backing in 1971, severing the last constraint on money printing. When the oil shock hit, the administration's solution was to print currency to subsidize fuel costs, to prop up the economy, to prevent the pain of adjustment. They believed they could print their way out of a physical supply shortage. The result was stagflation, a word that didn't exist in mainstream economics before the 1970s because Keynesian theory insisted it was impossible. You could have inflation or recession, the textbooks said, but never both simultaneously. The 1970s proved the textbooks catastrophically wrong. By 1974, the United States entered its worst recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment hit 9%. And prices kept rising. The misery index, unemployment plus inflation, climbed above 20. Middle-class families who had saved for retirement watched inflation devour their nest eggs in real time. But the real catastrophe was yet to come. The first oil shock was a warning shot. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution triggered a second shock. Oil prices surged again, this time reaching $40 per barrel by 1980, a 13-fold increase from 1970. Inflation peaked at 14.8%. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, was forced to raise interest rates to 20% just to break the inflationary spiral. 20%. Mortgages became impossible. Business loans evaporated. The economy seized. Real wages fell 15% between 1974 and 1982. An entire generation of middle-class Americans saw their standard of living collapse. Manufacturing cities that had thrived in the cheap oil era began their permanent decline: Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Buffalo. The sensory details tell the story the statistics can't. Government orders mandated thermostats be set no higher than 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Americans wore sweaters indoors in their own homes. Billboards along highways commanded, "Drive 55, to conserve fuel," a national speed limit imposed to stretch petroleum supplies. The President of the United States appeared on television in a cardigan, asking citizens to sacrifice, to accept a lower standard of living, to understand that the era of abundance was over. The political consequences were seismic. Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election in a landslide. The Reagan Revolution swept in on the back of energy crisis fury. The entire economic paradigm shifted: deregulation, supply-side economics, a fundamental restructuring of how government approached the economy. All because of oil. Sound familiar? The government printed money to solve a supply shock, which destroyed the currency and made everything worse. Just like the 1920s. Just like every time. The 1970s oil shocks proved that no amount of monetary manipulation can solve a physical commodity shortage. You just destroy the currency and make the crisis worse. That was 50 years ago. An entire generation of policymakers has retired or died. The people making decisions today were children in the 1970s, or not born yet. And the cycle is about to complete. We're here. Right now. Exactly 50 years from the 1970s oil shocks. And every single commodity is flashing red. The 1920s destroyed agriculture. The 1970s shattered the oil market. But the 2020s? This shock is hitting everything simultaneously. Food, energy, metals, fertilizer, water, industrial commodities. The entire physical foundation of modern civilization is entering a supply crisis at the exact moment the 50-year cycle predicted it would. And just like the farmers in 1919 and the policymakers in 1972, the people running the system today cannot see what's coming because they have never lived through it. Let's start with food. Since 2020, food prices have surged 30 to 40%. Not temporarily. Not in a spike that corrected. They went up and stayed up. Go to any grocery store in America, Europe, or Asia, and you'll see it. The cart that cost $150 in 2019 now costs $220. Same items. Same brands. Same quantities. 40% more expensive. And the prices aren't coming back down, because this isn't a demand problem that central banks can fix with interest rates. This is a supply problem rooted in decades of underinvestment, and supply problems take years to solve, if they can be solved at all. Energy? Oil, natural gas, and electricity are all facing structural shortages. Investment in oil and gas exploration has collapsed by 50% since 2014. An entire decade of underinvestment, driven by ESG mandates, green transition fantasies, and the naive belief that we could simply wish fossil fuels away. Meanwhile, demand kept growing. The infrastructure is decades behind where it needs to be. And now we're entering the shortage phase. Gas station price displays change daily, always upward. Electric bills have doubled in 24 months in many regions. Businesses are shutting down because they can't absorb energy costs. Then there are the metals. Copper, lithium, nickel, every commodity needed for the so-called green transition is in deficit. Copper inventories are at multi-decade lows. Not because of a temporary disruption. Because decades of underinvestment in mining left us without the supply capacity to meet surging demand. The same pattern. The same complacency. The same inevitable shortage. And fertilizer. In 2022, urea prices tripled, from $300 per ton to $900 per ton. Fertilizer. The substance that makes modern agriculture possible, that allows one farmer to feed 100 people instead of 10. When fertilizer prices triple, farmers plant less. When farmers plant less, food supplies tighten. When food supplies tighten, prices rise. And when food prices rise, societies destabilize. We're watching it happen in real time, and most people still think this is temporary. The government's response? Print money. Subsidize prices. Blame corporations. The exact same playbook that failed in the 1920s and 1970s. Since 2020, the United States has printed over $10 trillion. Globally, more than $20 trillion has been created out of thin air and injected into economies facing physical supply shortages. The result? Inflation peaked at 9.1% in 2022, a 40-year high. Real wages are falling. The middle class is being squeezed between rising costs and stagnant incomes. Food bank usage has surged 40 to 60% across developed nations. Political polarization is accelerating as populations look for someone to blame. And inflation, not terrorism, not climate change, not social issues, inflation has become the primary concern of voters worldwide. But here's the truly terrifying part, the real crisis hasn't even started yet. We're only in the early stages. Look at the warning signs. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been drained to 40-year lows in a desperate attempt to manipulate oil prices downward before elections. It's a temporary band-aid that makes the future shortage worse. Grain inventories globally are at historically tight levels. One bad harvest, one geopolitical disruption, and we're facing actual scarcity. Supply chains remain fragile 4 years after COVID exposed how brittle just-in-time logistics really are. Energy infrastructure is decades behind demand growth. Mining investment remains at generational lows despite all the rhetoric about green transitions and critical minerals. And geopolitics? Russia is threatening energy supplies to Europe. The Middle East remains a tinderbox. China and Taiwan are on a collision course that could disrupt semiconductor production and global shipping simultaneously. China itself is hoarding commodities at record levels. Their strategic reserves of grain, metals, and energy are at all-time highs. They see what's coming. They're preparing. Meanwhile, central banks are trapped. They can't raise interest rates high enough to truly crush inflation without collapsing the entire debt-saturated financial system. They're stuck between two catastrophic choices: let inflation run and destroy the currency, or raise rates and trigger a deflationary depression. There is no good option. There never is when you reach this stage of the cycle. We're in the early stages of shock phase 3, and every single warning sign that preceded the 1970s crisis is flashing, only this time, it's not just oil. It's everything. But here's what makes this cycle different, and far more dangerous than anything that came before. Let's be very clear about what makes this different. The 1920s agricultural collapse was devastating, generationally destructive, economically catastrophic, but it was regional and limited in scope. American and European farmers faced ruin. Banks in rural communities failed. But if you lived in a city, if you worked in manufacturing or services, you could survive the initial shock. You could, if necessary, grow some of your own food. There were escape routes for those who saw it coming. The 1970s oil crisis was global, far more widespread, and struck at the heart of industrial civilization. But it was still a single commodity. And single commodity shocks, as painful as they are, can eventually be solved. You invest in efficiency. You develop alternatives. You drill in new locations. You change behavior, drive less, insulate homes, downsize vehicles. Paul Volcker could raise interest rates to 20% to break the inflationary spiral. It was agonizing. Savings were destroyed. But the system survived. There was a policy tool that, however brutal, eventually worked. The 2020 shock is systemic. Food, energy, metals, water, fertilizer, every physical input that modern civilization requires, all entering shortage simultaneously. And this time, there are no escape valves. None. Let's talk scale. In 1973, the global oil market was worth roughly $500 billion. Today, the commodity complex, food, energy, metals, materials, exceeds $30 trillion. That's 60 times larger in nominal terms, and even accounting for inflation, it's an order of magnitude more significant to the global economy. When something this large breaks, it doesn't cause a recession. It restructures civilization. Then there's interconnection. The 1970s operated on regional supply chains with substantial inventory buffers. If a factory in Germany faced an oil shortage, it didn't immediately shut down a plant in Ohio. Modern just-in-time logistics eliminated those buffers in the name of efficiency. We've built a system so tightly optimized that when a single container ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal, global trade backs up for weeks. Supermarket shelves empty within 48 hours if trucking slows. There is no slack in the system. A shock anywhere becomes a shock everywhere, instantly. And then there's debt. In the 1970s, global debt stood at roughly 100% of GDP. Today? 350%. The entire global financial system is leveraged 3.5 times higher than it was during the last commodity shock. The 1970s had Volcker, who could raise rates to 20% to crush inflation. Try that today. 20% interest rates on $300 trillion in global debt would trigger an immediate, cascading collapse of sovereign bonds, corporate debt, mortgages, everything. The financial system cannot withstand the medicine that worked last time. Which brings us to policy tools, or rather, the complete absence of them. In the 1970s, the Federal Reserve started with interest rates around 6%. They had room to cut if needed, room to raise when necessary. In 2020, rates started at zero. Actually below zero in many countries. There was nowhere to go but up, and raising rates into a supply-driven inflation crisis doesn't increase supply, it just destroys demand by breaking the economy. We've already printed $20 trillion globally since 2020. More monetary expansion than the entire period from 2008 to 2020. And what did it get us? 9.1% inflation and shortages anyway, because you cannot print commodities. Can't drill or mine fast enough. Decades of underinvestment mean there's no spare capacity to bring online quickly. Oil and gas projects take 5 to 10 years from exploration to production. Copper mines take 15 years to develop. Lithium extraction requires massive infrastructure. Even if investment flooded in tomorrow, which it isn't, the supply wouldn't arrive until the late 2020s or 2030s. Far too late. Can't substitute. The entire green energy transition requires copper for wiring, lithium for batteries, nickel for components, rare earths for motors. You can't build solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles without these materials, and every one of them is in deficit. There are no alternatives at the scale needed. It's not a technological problem. It's a physics problem. Can't return to a gold standard. There isn't enough gold on Earth to back the current $100+ trillion monetary base without triggering an instant deflationary collapse far worse than the 1930s. In the 1920s, you could grow your own food if prices collapsed. In the 1970s, you could drive less if gas hit $1 a gallon. In the 2020s, you can't opt out. Food, energy, water, shelter, all tied to commodity prices, all spiking together, and there's nowhere to hide. Every previous cycle had an escape valve, a policy tool that could eventually work. This time, we've used them all, and we're still in the early stages of the shock. So the question isn't whether this ends badly. History has already answered that. The question is, what does badly look like when it's happening globally, simultaneously, with no policy tools left? The warning signs aren't subtle anymore. They're screaming. Strategic reserves across the globe are being deliberately drained in a desperate attempt to hide price spikes and buy time before elections. Government inflation metrics have been manipulated to understate reality. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, doesn't match anyone's lived experience. Official numbers say inflation is cooling. Your grocery bill, your energy costs, your rent, they say otherwise. The transitory narrative collapsed years ago, but the lie persists because admitting the truth would mean admitting there's no solution. And the social fabric is already tearing. French farmers are blocking highways with tractors, paralyzing entire regions in protest over fuel and fertilizer costs. The Sri Lankan government was literally stormed by protesters in 2022 after fuel prices made life unaffordable. German factories, backbone of European manufacturing, are shutting down because energy costs have made production economically impossible. In America, grocery stores are locking up basic items behind security glass because theft has surged as desperation rises. Political incumbents are losing elections at record rates globally. France, Germany, Italy, the United States, populations are voting out leadership in response to cost of living crises. And the replacements? They're not centrists. Political extremism is rising on both left and right as voters look for someone, anyone, who promises to end the pain. It's the same pattern that followed the 1920s commodity collapse. Economic desperation breeds political radicalization. The 1930s gave us fascism and communism. What will the 2030s bring? Central banks remain trapped in their impossible choice. Raise interest rates high enough to break inflation, and you trigger an economic collapse by shattering the $300 trillion global debt structure. Keep rates low, and you watch your currency get destroyed as inflation continues eating away purchasing power. There is no third option. Both paths lead to disaster. The only question is which disaster you choose. China sees what's coming. They hold over 50% of global grain reserves right now. 50%. They are hoarding food, energy, and strategic metals at levels never seen in modern history. This isn't market activity. This is preparation for a crisis they know is coming. Meanwhile, Western nations continue draining their reserves to manipulate prices for short-term political gain. When the 1920s commodity shock hit, it triggered the Great Depression and set the stage for World War II. When the 1970s shock hit, it destroyed currencies and ended the post-war economic order. When this shock fully unfolds, it won't be regional, it will be global. It won't last years. The financial system can't absorb a decade-long crisis with this much debt. And it won't end with just economic pain. Food scarcity is already triggering mass migration from developing nations. Energy shortages are forcing industrial shutdowns. Europe's winter of 2022 was a preview. Currency crises are spreading from periphery to core as dollar strength crushes emerging markets. Turkey, Argentina, Egypt, their currencies are collapsing in real time. Political systems are fracturing under economic strain. Democratic backsliding is accelerating globally. And resource conflicts are multiplying. Taiwan's semiconductors, Middle Eastern oil, Ukrainian grain, every critical commodity is becoming a flashpoint. Every empire believed they were different. Rome thought their civilization was eternal. Weimar Germany thought they could print their way out. The 1970s leaders thought Keynesian economics had ended boom-bust cycles. Every single time, they were wrong. The pattern doesn't care about central bank PHDS, modern monetary theory, or AI optimization. The pattern is 50 years old, and it's never been wrong. The 50-year commodity shock cycle has completed 3 times now, and it has never failed. Not once. The 1920s, commodity boom turned to bust, triggered depression, and set the stage for global war. The 1970s, commodity boom turned to bust, created stagflation, destroyed currencies, and ended the post-war economic order. The 2020s, we're entering the shock phase right now, and every single indicator says this one will be worse than anything that came before. The pattern never changes, only the names, dates, and the scale of destruction. Governments always respond the same way. Deny the crisis. Print money to delay the pain. Blame corporations, foreigners, or speculators. Then lose control as the physical reality of scarcity overwhelms monetary manipulation. Modern tools, money printing, interest rate manipulation, strategic reserve drawdowns, they're not solutions. They're just ways to delay and amplify the inevitable collapse. They believe this time is different. They always do. So let's be absolutely clear about what we're facing. The question isn't whether another commodity shock is coming, we're already in it. The question isn't whether governments will respond with money printing, they already are. The question isn't whether this ends badly, history has answered that question 3 times over. The only question is when the shock phase fully unfolds, and whether you will be ready when it does. The cycle is 50 years long, and we're past the 50-year mark. The shocks come in threes, 1920s, 1970s, 2020s. Every previous shock restructured the global order, this one will be no different. You can't opt out of food, energy, and water. You can't print commodities. You can't substitute physics. And you can't ignore a pattern that has never failed and won't start now. The Roman Empire believed grain would always flow from Egypt, until it didn't. The 1920s farmers believed abundance would last forever, until it didn't. The 1970s economies believed cheap oil was a birthright, until it wasn't. Today's leaders believe modern finance has solved scarcity. History says they're about to learn the same lesson, the same way everyone before them did. If this opened your eyes to the pattern, if you see what's coming before it fully unfolds, hit subscribe. Because the next few years are going to separate those who understand history from those who get crushed by it. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore its lessons, it will crush you. The 50-year commodity shock cycle is complete. And it always ends the same way.